In a town known for its harmony, one man's heartbreak would turn it into a place of horror. Palmetto Grove, Florida. A place where the sun seems to shine a little brighter, where Sunday mornings echo with gospel hymns and neighbors greet each other with warm smiles. It's a town where faith isn't just a belief, it's a way of life. And at the heart of it all stood Ezekiel Harmony, or as everyone called him, Zeke, a man whose voice could lift the heaviest of spirits. With every note he sang, the congregation felt a sense of peace, of hope, of something greater. To them, Zeke wasn't just a singer. He was a vessel of God's love. His gospel albums soared in popularity, reaching far beyond the church pews of Palmetto Grove. It wasn't long before his face appeared on local billboards, his songs played on the radio, and his presence was requested at events all over the state. And alongside him, always, was Melody Grace. Her name, fitting in ways too perfect to ignore. She was beautiful, kind, and had a voice that blended with Zeke's like it was made to. Together, they were seen as the perfect couple, two souls united by faith and music, destined for greatness. To outsiders, their love was something out of a dream. Hand in hand at church services, eyes locked during performances, and smiles exchanged so effortlessly it seemed almost rehearsed. Zeke had it all: success, a loving fiancée, and the unwavering support of his community. But the thing about perfection, it doesn't leave room for doubt. And yet, beneath the surface, doubts were creeping in. Late-night phone calls Melody wouldn't explain. A distance in her gaze when she thought he wasn't looking. A hesitation in her touch. And then came the night of his album release party. The celebration that was supposed to be a pinnacle of his career. The church was packed, applause echoed through the halls, and Zeke stood under the warm glow of the stage lights, soaking in the moment. But just beyond the crowd, in the quiet shadows of the parking lot, something else was happening. Zeke stepped outside for a breath of air, only to be met with a sight that would burn itself into his mind forever. Melody in the arms of his cousin Lucas. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath caught in his throat. Everything around him, the laughter, the music, the applause, became distant noise, swallowed by the cold realization of betrayal. The perfect life he had built, the love he had cherished, shattered in an instant. And in its place, something darker began to take hold. Ezekiel Harmony was born and raised in the heart of Palmetto Grove, a town where faith was not just a foundation, it was everything. Sundays were sacred, gospel music was a way of life, and the church was more than a building. It was a sanctuary that shaped lives. For Zeke, it was the place where his voice was first heard, where his talent was nurtured, and where he became something greater in the eyes of those who knew him. His mother, a devout woman who never missed a service, often said that Zeke's voice was a gift from God himself. By the age of 10, he was leading the children's choir, his voice rising above the others, pure and powerful. As he grew older, so did his reputation. Soon, he wasn't just the boy with the golden voice. He was a young man destined for something far beyond the small town he called home. By his early 20s, Zeke had released his first gospel album, and it resonated deeply with people far beyond Palmetto Grove. His songs of faith and redemption climbed local charts, and his name started to mean something outside of church circles. For the people of his town, Zeke wasn't just a singer. He was a beacon of hope, a living testament to what faith could achieve. They adored him, praised him, and in their eyes, he could do no wrong. But beneath the adoration, there was something else, a quiet, lingering doubt, a whisper in the back of his mind that questioned if he was truly deserving of the pedestal they placed him on. And when it came to Melody Grace, that whisper turned into a voice he couldn't silence. Melody wasn't just his fiancée. She was his muse, his partner, and the only person who truly understood his world. A choir singer with an angelic voice, and a dream that stretched far beyond the church pews. She grew up on gospel, but deep down, she longed for something more. There was always an undeniable spark in her, a restlessness that hinted at dreams she didn't always share with Zeke. Before she met him, Melody's life had been a series of near misses and wrong turns. She had once chased fame in the city, But the promises made to her there were fleeting, empty. When she returned to Palmetto Grove, humbled and heartbroken, Zeke was the one who gave her a second chance. Not just in music, but in life. He saw her pain, her potential, and he loved her for it. But there were whispers, old wounds that hadn't fully healed. Rumors of past relationships, of Melody's tendency to stray when things became too comfortable. Zeke dismissed them, convincing himself that love was enough to keep her grounded, that faith would hold them together. And then there was Lucas. Zeke's cousin had always been in the background, always a step behind. If Zeke was the star, Lucas was the shadow. He grew up in the same church, sang in the same choir, but no one ever looked at him the way they did Zeke. Where Zeke's voice soared effortlessly, Lucas's was strained, searching. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the comparisons, the feeling of being less. But Lucas had something Zeke didn't, a charm that worked in ways Zeke couldn't quite grasp, a way of making people feel seen, of slipping into their good graces with ease. It was something that had always made Zeke uneasy, and when Melody and Lucas started spending more time together, that unease turned into something heavier. They were family. Trust was supposed to be a given. But there were moments, fleeting glances, lingering smiles, that Zeke couldn't ignore. He told himself it was nothing, that he was being paranoid. But deep down, the doubts gnawed at him. Lucas, for his part, never said much about it. He played the role of the supportive cousin, standing in Zeke's shadow as always, smiling that familiar smile, never showing his hand. But behind the scenes, their lives were tangled in ways that Zeke was only beginning to realize. The weight of expectations, the silent rivalry, the competition that no one dared to speak about openly. And then, in a single moment, it all unraveled. The embrace in the parking lot. The betrayal that cut deeper than any wound Zeke had ever known. The confirmation of every fear he had tried to bury. In that instant, the lines between love and jealousy, faith and fury, blurred beyond recognition. And what followed next would leave a town once filled with music drowning in silence. The night of Zeke Harmony's album release party was supposed to be a celebration of faith, of music, of triumph. The town of Palmetto Grove had never seen anything quite like it. The church was packed beyond capacity, every pew filled with faces beaming with pride. The glow of the chandeliers cast a golden hue across the sanctuary, and the scent of fresh lilies, Melody's favorite, drifted through the air. The anticipation was electric. Friends, family, and even strangers who had traveled from neighboring towns gathered, eager to witness the man who had become their guiding light. Zeke stood at the front, his voice rising above the organ's deep hum, his eyes closed in devotion as he sang the opening hymn. This was his moment, the culmination of years of dedication, sacrifice, and unwavering faith. Melody stood in the choir, her voice blending effortlessly with his, just as it always had. Her eyes met his across the room, and for a fleeting second, Zeke felt something stir in his chest, pride, love, hope. He told himself that tonight was the beginning of something new. Their love, their future. Everything was finally falling into place. Applause erupted as the final note hung in the air, and Zeke's heart swelled with gratitude. This was the life he had always dreamed of, the life he had worked so hard to build. He shook hands, accepted congratulations, and basked in the warmth of admiration from those who had always believed in him. But beneath the surface, something gnawed at him. Melody had been distant all evening, smiling when she needed to, laughing at the right moments. But there was something in her eyes he couldn't quite place. An absence, a hesitation. As the evening pressed on, Zeke needed a moment of quiet. The crowd, the flashing cameras, the endless praise, it was all beginning to feel suffocating. He stepped outside, letting the cool night air fill his lungs, the sounds of the celebration muffled behind him. And that's when he saw them. In the dim light of the church parking lot, just beyond the stained glass windows, Melody stood pressed against Lucas. Zeke froze, his breath catching in his throat. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a misunderstanding. But then, he saw Lucas's hand brush against Melody's waist, saw the way she leaned into him, their faces just inches apart. Time seemed to slow. The music inside faded into nothingness, and all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. Every doubt, every whisper, every quiet suspicion that he had buried came rushing to the surface. His fiancée, his cousin. Zeke felt his chest tighten, a slow burn creeping through his veins. He wanted to look away, to pretend he hadn't seen it, but he couldn't. His feet felt rooted to the ground, his eyes locked on the scene unfolding before him. Then Melody noticed him. Her eyes widened in shock, and she pushed away from Lucas, her face suddenly pale under the flickering streetlights. "Zeke," she whispered, taking a step toward him. Her voice trembled, a mixture of guilt and fear. Zeke didn't speak. He couldn't. The weight of betrayal settled deep in his bones, twisting his stomach in knots. Lucas, always so smug, didn't even flinch. He straightened his shirt, a ghost of a smirk playing at the corners of his lips, as if this was inevitable, as if it had always been leading to this. "Zeke, please," Melody pleaded, reaching for him. But he took a step back, his fists clenched at his sides. His mind raced, memories of their life together, their plans, the promises they had made. How long had this been going on? How many times had he been made a fool? Melody's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling. "It's not what it looks like," she said, the words weak, empty. But Zeke didn't need to hear an explanation. He had seen enough. The ache in his chest grew sharper, cutting deep, deeper than he thought possible. The love, the trust, the faith, it all crumbled in an instant, leaving behind something far darker. Without a word, he turned and walked away, back into the church where his name still echoed in celebration. But inside him, there was no joy left, only the growing storm of heartbreak, humiliation, and something else, something he couldn't quite name, but could feel pressing against the edges of his mind, something that wouldn't stay buried for long. Zeke didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the image of Melody and Lucas seared into his mind like a scar that refused to fade. The room, usually a place of comfort and prayer, felt hollow, haunted by echoes of her laughter, of whispered promises that now meant nothing. The walls seemed to close in, and the darkness felt heavier than it ever had before. In the quiet, his mind wandered back, years back, to a time when he and Lucas were just boys. Church bells ringing in the distance, the warm Florida sun shining down on them as they raced across the field behind the old church. Zeke had always been a step ahead, faster, stronger, more talented. And Lucas? Lucas was always behind him, watching, waiting. Zeke remembered the Sunday mornings when their grandmother would gather them on the porch, her soft voice telling them, "God gives each of us a gift, boys, but it's up to you to use it right." Zeke had always known his gift, his voice. It lifted people up, brought them peace. Lucas, though, never seemed to find his. He lingered in the background, always quick with a smile, but there was something else, something that Zeke could never quite put his finger on. A quiet resentment, a shadow beneath the surface. And now, all these years later, that same shadow had taken everything from him. Zeke sat up in bed, his breath ragged, hands shaking as he reached for his Bible. He flipped through the pages, searching for solace, for answers. He read the words, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord," but they felt empty, distant. He prayed, but his prayers were laced with anger, with questions that gnawed at his soul. Why did this happen? Why had God let it happen? Days passed, but the questions never stopped. Zeke threw himself into his music, trying to drown out the noise in his head, but every note felt forced, hollow. Church members noticed the shift. His voice, once filled with passion, now sounded strained. He smiled less, spoke even less. Friends reached out, asking if he was all right, but Zeke only nodded, offering vague reassurances. He wasn't all right. At night, he would sit in his backyard, staring at the garden shed where he kept his tools. The machete hung on the wall, its blade gleaming in the moonlight. He had used it so many times to clear the weeds, to shape the garden, to build. It was a tool of creation. But now, as he stared at it, it felt different. It felt like something else, something final. He began to plan, though he told himself it wasn't planning. It was preparing. He would invite Melody over, sit her down, and they would talk. He would show her that he forgave her, that love and faith could overcome even this. He would make her see what she had done to him, to them. But deep down, Zeke knew this wasn't about forgiveness. It was about something else, something darker, something he could no longer control. One evening, after choir practice, he sat alone with Pastor Green, a man he had always looked up to. The pastor spoke of grace, of letting go of pain, but Zeke's mind was somewhere else. He nodded at the right moments, smiled when expected, but inside, the rage was building. "You have to let God carry your burdens, son," the pastor said gently, resting a hand on Zeke's shoulder. Zeke forced a smile. "I know, Pastor. I'm trying." But he wasn't. He was slipping further, deeper into something he didn't recognize. Melody, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him, continued on as if nothing had happened. She texted him, asked to meet, said she wanted to talk. Zeke agreed. He told her he understood, that he wanted to work through things. She was relieved. He could hear it in her voice. She still believed in him, in his kindness, in his unwavering faith. The night before their meeting, Zeke sat on the porch, staring into the darkness. The machete was in his hands now, heavy and cold. He traced his fingers along the blade, thinking about how something so simple, so useful, could become something else entirely in the wrong hands. A tool of destruction, not creation. He thought of the way Melody had looked at Lucas, the way Lucas had smirked, the whispers, the stolen glances, the quiet betrayal that had been right in front of him all along. It was never a question of if, it was when. And now, Zeke believed, it was his time to act. He told himself it wasn't murder. It was justice. Justice for the years of being the good man, the faithful man. Justice for the humiliation, for the love that had been thrown away so carelessly. The next morning, he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his suit, his hands steady for the first time in days. He rehearsed the words he would say to Melody, how he would bring her inside, how he would get her to sit down, how he would make her understand. In his mind, it all made sense. And yet, as he walked into the living room and saw the family Bible sitting on the table, something inside him wavered. His faith, the thing that had guided him his entire life, was it still there? Was he truly about to do something he could never take back? He closed his eyes, whispering one final prayer. But this time, he didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked for strength. And in that moment, Zeke Harmony made a choice that would change everything. Melody arrived at Zeke's home just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. She stepped out of her car, smoothing down the front of her dress, her expression cautious but hopeful. She wanted to believe that things could be fixed, that love could triumph over mistakes. The familiar house, once a symbol of their shared dreams, now felt different, colder, heavier. Inside, Zeke stood by the window watching her. His hands were steady, his breath even. The Bible lay closed on the table, but his eyes were fixed on something else. The machete, gleaming faintly in the dim light of the living room. It was still where he had left it, just within reach. He opened the door before she could knock. "Come in," he said, his voice calm. Melody stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. Everything looked the same. Zeke's awards lined the shelves. Framed photos of them smiling at past events still hung on the walls. It felt staged, like a relic of something that no longer existed. "Zeke, I want to talk," she started, her voice unsure. He nodded slowly, motioning to the couch. "Sit." She did, fidgeting with her hands, glancing up at him with the same wide-eyed innocence that had once melted his heart. But tonight, it only fueled the fire burning inside him. He sat across from her, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You love me, right?" he asked, his voice deceptively soft. "Of course I do," Melody replied quickly. "Zeke, I know what you saw, but it's not what you think." It wasn't. Before she could finish, Zeke reached into the drawer beside him and pulled out a stack of photographs. He spread them across the coffee table, each one more damning than the last. Melody and Lucas, together in places they thought no one would see. outside a restaurant, at the park, in Lucas's car. Every moment captured, frozen in time, undeniable. Melody's breath caught in her throat. Zeke, how long? He cut her off, his voice trembling now, the calm slipping away. She stared down at the photos, shaking her head. I made a mistake, she whispered. It didn't mean anything. I was confused, Zeke stood abruptly, pacing the room, his fingers raking through his hair. You were confused? While you were with my cousin, my own blood. His voice rose, echoing through the house. Melody's eyes filled with tears. I never wanted to hurt you. He stopped, turning to face her. But you did. His voice was quieter now, almost eerily so. Do you know how many nights I've sat here, praying for answers? Asking God why I wasn't enough for you. Melody reached out tentatively. Zeke, please. I still love you. He flinched at the words, something inside him snapping. No, he said, shaking his head slowly. No, you don't. The tension in the room thickened. Melody glanced toward the door, the sudden realization dawning on her that this wasn't going to end the way she had hoped. She rose to her feet, backing toward the exit. I should go, she said cautiously. Zeke moved faster than she expected, blocking her path. You don't get to just leave, he said, his voice low, unrelenting. She tried to step around him, but his grip tightened around her wrist. Let me go, Zeke. Panic crept into her voice now. His eyes darkened, his breathing ragged. You don't get to walk away after everything you've done, after what you've taken from me. Melody struggled, pulling away, but Zeke's grip didn't loosen. In a flash, his hand darted toward the machete resting on the shelf, and before Melody could scream, it was in his grasp. The blade glinted under the flickering light, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Zeke, Melody pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Please, we can fix this. I love. But the words were drowned out by the sound of the blade slicing through the air. It happened so fast. One moment, she was pleading, and the next, she was falling. A pool of crimson spreading across the floor, her eyes wide in disbelief. Lips parted as if trying to say something, anything. Zeke stood over her, his chest heaving, his mind racing. The weight of the machete in his hand felt different now, heavier, final. His heart pounded, but there was no turning back. The room fell silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere in the neighborhood. He dropped the machete, his hands trembling as he knelt beside her lifeless body. His fingers brushed against her cheek, smearing blood across her skin. Slowly, methodically, he began to arrange the scene. He lifted Melody's head, placing it gently on the coffee table beside the photographs. He wiped his hands on his shirt, his movements mechanical, detached. And then he began to sing, a soft hymn, the same one they had performed together so many times. His voice, though shaken, carried through the house like a lament, a final tribute to the woman he once loved. Hours passed, and as the first rays of dawn crept through the windows, a knock echoed through the house. Lucas! Zeke opened the door, his face unreadable. Lucas stepped inside, the familiar smirk still tugging at his lips. But it faded the moment he saw the scene before him. Melody's lifeless eyes staring back at him. The blood, the machete. His body stiffened, his mouth opening to speak. But no words came out. Before he could react, Zeke seized him, dragging him through the room with a strength fueled by something beyond rage. Lucas fought, but Zeke's grip was unrelenting, his movements purposeful. Minutes later, Lucas was bound to a chair in the backyard, forced to stare at the grim display inside the house. His muffled cries were drowned out by Zeke's voice, soft, steady, unwavering, as he continued to sing, his hands raised to the heavens in prayer. Neighbors would later say they heard the singing before they saw the police lights. They would whisper about how it echoed through the early morning mist, haunting and unending. By the time the authorities arrived, Zeke was on his knees, hands raised, the machete resting beside him like an offering. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He simply stared at Melody's head on the table, his lips moving in silent prayer. It was just after dawn when the first call came in. A neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, had been up early tending to her roses when she heard it. The sound of singing, soft at first, then louder, carrying through the morning mist. She recognized the voice immediately. Everyone in Palmetto Grove knew Ezekiel Harmony's voice. But there was something different this time. Something off. The melody drifted through the air like a mournful prayer, slow and deliberate, repeating over and over again. Detectives sat Zeke down at the station, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across his face. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't ask for anything. Instead, he sat calmly, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes staring straight ahead. When they asked him why, his response was simple. I did what had to be done. Melody didn't deserve this. The detective pressed, his voice heavy with frustration. Zeke tilted his head slightly, his expression unwavering. She was lost. I helped her find her way. What about Lucas? Zeke's eyes darkened. He took what wasn't his, but I showed him. The detective leaned back, exhaling slowly. And you think this was God's will? Zeke smiled faintly. It was justice. The interview ended, but the questions lingered. Had Zeke always been capable of this? Had something snapped inside him? Or had this darkness been festering all along? Hidden beneath years of devotion and song? Back at the crime scene, officers continued their search, unearthing more unsettling details. Letters Melody had written but never sent, voicemails deleted but recovered, all painting a picture of a woman trapped in a relationship she no longer knew how to escape from. The town was left reeling. Zeke Harmony, the man they had trusted, the voice they had adored, had become something else entirely. And now, they were left with a question they never thought they'd have to ask. How well do you really know someone? The trial of Ezekiel Harmony captivated the nation. It wasn't just another crime story. It was a fall from grace so staggering that people struggled to believe it. The man whose voice once filled churches with hope now stood accused of an unspeakable act of violence. And as the courtroom filled with reporters, family members, and curious onlookers, the question lingered in the air like a heavy fog. Was Zeke Harmony a man broken by betrayal? Or had he always been capable of such horror? Inside the courtroom, Zeke sat motionless, dressed in a crisp suit that did little to hide the weariness in his eyes. His hands remained folded neatly in his lap, and his expression, once so full of passion and conviction, was now blank, as if the weight of his actions had drained him of everything he once was. The defense wasted no time in building their case. They portrayed Zeke as a man consumed by years of emotional turmoil, driven to the edge by betrayal and an overwhelming sense of failure. They called experts to the stand, psychiatrists who spoke of religious delusions, of a man who believed he was carrying out God's will. One expert, a psychologist specializing in religious trauma, testified, Mr. Harmony's entire identity was built on faith, loyalty, and devotion. When those foundations crumbled, he experienced a profound psychological break, leading him to believe he was acting under divine command. Zeke's defense attorneys argued that he had been pushed past his breaking point, that his deep-rooted religious beliefs, combined with Melody's betrayal and Lucas's deception, had created a perfect storm of emotional instability. They painted him not as a monster, but as a man who had simply lost his way, one who needed help, not punishment. But the prosecution had a very different narrative. To them, Zeke was not a man of faith, but a man of control, one who carefully orchestrated his revenge with chilling precision. They recounted how he lured Melody to his home under false pretenses, how he tied Lucas to a chair and forced him to witness the aftermath. They showed the jury the machete, the carefully arranged crime scene, and Zeke's eerily calm demeanor in his confession. Prosecutor Elaine Garrison stood before the jury, her voice sharp and unyielding. Ladies and gentlemen, this was not the act of an insane man. This was cold, calculated murder. Zeke Harmony did not break, he planned. He executed. And then he sang. The courtroom gasped when the chilling audio recording was played, the hymn Zeke sang as he knelt beside Melody's lifeless body. The once soothing voice that had brought comfort to so many now echoed through the courtroom like a haunting reminder of what he had done. Friends and family took the stand, their voices trembling with emotion. Melody's mother sobbed as she described her daughter's dreams, her kindness, and how she had trusted Zeke. Church members who once idolized him now struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the man they saw in the defendant's chair. Pastor Green's voice broke as he testified. "I don't understand it. Jake of us. He was one of us. We all loved him. We trusted him. But now, I don't know who he is anymore." Lucas, still shaken, took the stand and recounted the horrifying night, his voice wavering as he described the terror of being tied up, forced to watch his cousin commit the unimaginable. He told me God had spoken to him, that he had to do it." Outside the courtroom, the media circus raged on. Headlines splashed across newspapers and television screens. Gospel star gone mad. Faith, betrayal, and murder. The Ezekiel Harmony tragedy. A voice from heaven. A heart full of darkness. True crime podcasts dissected every detail, and social media erupted with speculation. Some still clung to the belief that Zeke had been pushed too far, while others saw him as nothing more than a wolf in sheep's clothing. Public opinion was divided. There were those who prayed for him, hoping for redemption, and those who demanded justice, believing that no amount of faith could excuse what he had done. After weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and emotional breakdowns, the jury finally reached a verdict. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence as the judge asked the foreperson to speak. "We, the jury, find the defendant Ezekiel Harmony." Zeke sat still, his eyes locked straight ahead, his lips pressed together in silent prayer. "Guilty of first-degree murder." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Melody's family clung to each other, tears streaming down their faces. Zeke closed his eyes, his expression unreadable, as if he had already known the outcome long before the words were spoken. The judge's voice rang out, stern and resolute. "Ezekiel Harmony, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The gavel struck, and just like that, it was over. As Zeke was led away in handcuffs, he turned to the crowd, his gaze falling on Lucas for a brief moment. There was no anger, no remorse, only a quiet resignation. He whispered something under his breath, words that no one but himself could hear. Outside the courthouse, the crowds had already begun to disperse, leaving only the echoes of a life that once was. The town of Palmetto Grove would never be the same. The church, once filled with Zeke's songs, now stood in uneasy silence. His records were pulled from store shelves, his music erased from playlists. And yet, for those who had once known him, his voice lingered, haunting, unforgettable, and forever changed.